A very warm welcome. Thank you very much for choosing to join this CILT and Skill Dynamics webinar. I'm aware that there's a lot of events happening today within the supply chain procurement and logistics spectrum. So thank you very much for choosing to join this one and for joining us today here, because I think, you know, we are witnessing a new wave of technology and innovation, and that is on course to disrupt global supply chains as we know it. And really what my aim is going to be, at least for the next 40 minutes or so, is really to share with you some of my perspectives based on some of the reports that we have been creating here at Skill Dynamics, and also to reflect with you some of my perspectives. So Jess, if you could just go to the next slide. So, as I said, my aim today is to present some of these and highlight the importance of, you know, upskilling an agile and a resilient workforce. Now, we're all aware that we live in a radical state of uncertainty, from geopolitical issues, the rise of nationalism and protectionism in Europe and indeed across the world, natural disasters, the climate crisis, financial chaos, terrorist attacks, commodity scarcity, it could be social media disruptions, and lastly but not least, the global pandemic. They've all taken their toll on global supply chains. And thanks also to the rapid advancements in technology and the widespread use of the internet as a business communication and collaboration tool, the threat of cyber risk has become very real. It impacts all supply chains, from healthcare to finance to retail, with all internet users at risk of becoming cyber victims. Now, of course, it doesn't take a natural disaster or a national catastrophe to disrupt our supply chains. In some cases, as we've seen quite recently, it could be a single key supplier whose operations fail or become insolvent. This can bring even the most well-oiled supply chain to a screeching halt, as we saw with Apple and many automotive supply chains, many automotive businesses. And this can leave a lot of organizations really scrambling to replace that critical challenge. And I would say that today's lean supply chains are particularly susceptible to all of these problems. Now, just for a second, I'd like you to question this statement by Klaus Schwab, who said that the acceleration of innovation and the velocity of disruption are hard to comprehend or anticipate. And these drivers constitute a source of constant surprise, even for the best connected and the most well-informed. So just give that a thought for a second. How does that statement make you feel? How does the prospect of constant surprise make you feel? Does it keep you up at night? What changes do you expect to see and make within your own businesses, within your own organizations? Or indeed, ask yourselves, how are you going to stay ahead of the constant technological innovations and the speed of disruption that we really see all around us today? Now, I think that the challenge for supply chain organizations and their management teams is actually staying ahead, of all of these rapidly changing landscape. What we've got to think about is, what exactly are the implications of all of these changes? What will it mean for our supply chain's resilience and agility? But furthermore, what new skills will our supply chain organizations actually have to acquire? Next slide, please, Jess. Now, thanks to data science and predictive analytics, it's easier to anticipate and meet demand. And thanks to the automation and the Internet of Things, warehousing processes and the associated technologies that come along with that are being transformed. Thanks to evolving e-commerce paradigms and technologies, our consumers' expectations are being revolutionized, with same-day deliveries are now commonplace across many urban locations. Transport, data flows, final mile logistics, again, technology is really redefining the art of the possible. Now, I think under this current climate of the great resignation and evolving management paradigms, management concept recalls, exponential innovations, and disruptive business models, our supply chains and the people in our supply chains are more important than ever. And the challenge to my mind is, how quickly can we innovate our supply chain professionals to thrive in an ever-changing world? If you could just click, Jess. Now, my aim is to really share some of my perspectives on these innovations, on those innovations that I believe will have some of the biggest impacts. And these are digital, sustainability, and upskilling our workforce to avoid widening the gap between supply chain innovations and the skills that are necessary to actually future-proof our supply chains. Next slide, please, Jess. Now, artificial intelligence, we can go back to the other slide actually, Jess, sorry. Artificial intelligence, I'd just like to make a point about that, because when we think about AI and Industry 4.0, we've seen the massive strides in recent years, from self-driving cars and automation to drones and virtual assistant, and all of these can be performed, can be programmed to perform complex, non-repetitive tasks. You probably already know it was predicted by the World Economic Forum, in fact, that estimated that by 2025, around 1/3 of manufacturing will be automated, and robotics will work alongside humans, complementing their skills, but only faster. Now, to some, the rise of artificial intelligence or robotics, it may seem a little bit of a fantasy or far-fetched, but it was also indicated by the World Economic Forum that by 2026, artificial intelligent machines will be part of our company's board of directors. Almost impossible to imagine now, but smartphones, drones, and driverless cars were equally hard to imagine just a decade ago. Now, what I want you to consider, though, is the combined forces of these disruptive technologies. This will have an even greater effect. I mean, consider combining new materials which have unimaginable properties like graphene, when it's used with technologies such as 3D printing, and then that's enabled by social media and other mobile devices. It could put production back into the hands of individuals in a way that we've not seen before the days of the first industrial revolution. And this will have huge consequences on the way that we behave and organize ourselves economically, socially, and politically. And under this current climate of the Great Resignation, as I was mentioning earlier, and these sort of evolving management paradigms, disruptive business models, management concept recalls, our supply chains and the people in them are more important than ever. So let's move on. Next slide, please, Jess. Talking about the idea of globalization. This is the era that characterizes the advancement of technology, which will be felt across our, which will touch every aspect of our lives. The speed, the scope, and the impact of these digital transformations are far beyond anything we've ever encountered before. Furthermore, I would say Industry 4.0 is about scale customization. Now, just imagine a world where you can buy the exact product that you want, featuring the functionality that you want, with the design you want, and at the same cost and lead time as a product that was mass produced. Industry 4.0 makes that possible. Advanced robotics can be programmed to produce any product configuration with any setup time or ramp-up time. And 3D printing, we've seen, can instantaneously produce any customized design. Industry 4.0 allows the supply chain to produce a batch of one product at the same cost and lead time as many. Now, let's just throw in some more technologies that we've seen that are characteristic of Industry 4.0, such as blockchain, predictive modeling, advanced planning and scheduling, the Internet of Things. Automation enhanced last mile delivery. Taken together, all of these are manifestations of the same thing. They are aspects of our supply chains that have been digitally enhanced to bring about capabilities that were once considered unimaginable. Now, by leveraging digital information technology, some companies we've seen are making considerable gains, considerable improvements to their performance. They're transforming their supply chains to make them more resilient, to make them more agile and more responsive. And they've also benefited from cost savings. And these have been either seen through things like productivity improvements, better sourcing, less waste, or simply just better insights into both demand and the underlying operation of the supply chain. But too often, these examples that I've just highlighted are probably just standalone instances of information technology at work. Today's cutting-edge technologies are islands of excellence. They're initiatives where information technology has been harnessed to improve one particular aspect of the supply chain. Whereas we supply chain professionals know full well that the real goal is something else. Namely, it's really about achieving a true end-to-end digitalized supply chains, where information technology is used not to just enhance one particular part of the supply chain, but the entire supply chain. Now, I'm not saying getting there is easy or straightforward, but we're seeing progress is being made, particularly with those companies that we see as startups who have the novelty to start, from the drawing board. And I appreciate that some aspects of the tasks are a lot easier than others. But I think companies which have got the will and the determination to overcome the hurdles that we will experience, they will significantly advance towards true end-to-end digitalized supply chains. I really think that's possible. Next slide, please, Jess. Now, I've been thinking a lot about disruptive ideas of late. And in particular, I've been thinking a lot about disruptive ideas in the context of sustainability. And the conclusion that I've come to is that we might need some fresh disruptive ideas and business models if the sustainability agenda is to make much more progress than it is today. Now, for me personally, one of the most persuasive signs that the current approaches to sustainability aren't delivering fast enough came from a paper that I read in the Harvard Business Review. It was in 2019 that influential management thinker John Elkington took to its pages to officially recall its management concept called the triple bottom line. And this was really about saying, it was basically recalling a concept that it stated, or it launched 25 years ago. And simply put, what John Elkington, the reason why he argued for recalling the triple bottom line was he said that it was just no longer enough. Something else was needed. Something bolder was needed. And the idea behind the triple bottom line, quite originally, was quite simple. What his intention was that instead of focusing on just profit, the triple bottom line sought to actually get businesses to view their performance in a much more broader context, examining their social, environment, and economic impact. And the concept had a powerful impact at the time, but 25 years on, can we say it's made a big difference? I would say it made a really big difference, but it isn't enough. And this was also acknowledged by John Elkington, who basically felt that too many businesses were viewing the triple bottom line as a trade-off mechanism rather than as an absolute test. He basically said that something else is needed if we're really going to shift the needle. And he actually quite eloquently put it that we've had a hide-wide cultural problem in business. finance, and markets. Whereas CEOs and CFOs and other corporate leaders move heaven and earth to ensure that they hit their profit targets, the same is rarely true for people and planet targets. Now, John's assumption has been that the world, could we go to the next slide, please, Jess? Thank you. John's assumption was that that the world is heading into the U-bend of historic proportions. This goes well beyond a single normal recession. Instead, he believes that we're heading into a period where the established macroeconomic and political order goes down the tube while new ones start beginning to surface. And as we start heading deeper into this sort of U-bend, we enter into this sort of dark area, a time of maximum confusion, uncertainty, fear, and anger. And meanwhile, as we saw in the last 2 years, like an X-ray, COVID-19 just illuminated the critical fault lines in our societies. And it underscored the lack of transparency, for example, in China, the wealth divides in countries as diverse as France and the United States, and all of the different vulnerabilities of people of different ages and in different states of health. Now, when Nassim Nicholas Taleb launched the Black Swan concept in 2007. Thanks, Jess. This was launched back in 2007 on the threshold of the financial crisis. Now, Nassim Taleb was very specific about what he meant. A black swan, he said, was an event that comes at an immense surprise. It has a major impact and is often poorly understood, and rationalization takes place after the event has occurred. He suggests that a green swan is a symbol of radically better times to come. Green swans, so this is John Elkington now. John Elkington basically believes that green swans are much more profound market shifts. They're generally catalyzed by some combination of black or grey swans. We're seeing a lot of swans today. But basically, it's a combination of these challenges and changing paradigms, values, mindsets, and politics, policies, technologies that I've just been talking about, business models, and other key factors. A green swan, according to John Elkington, delivers on exponential progress in the form of economic, social, and environmental wealth creation. And he acknowledges that getting there will not be easy, but at the times that we're going through today, times of disruptive change, a new order is certainly required, because we're going to see social and political shockwaves that can last for decades, even for generations. So the green swan in some ways is John's answer to the management concept recall of the triple bottom line. Now, at worst, the triple bottom line basically achieves an outcome in 2 dimensions whilst holding the third steady. There may be a period of adjustment where one or more dimensions underperforms, but the aim is an integrated breakthrough in all 3 dimensions. So many companies were quite poor and prepared to deal with crises like the ones we're seeing today. They went into the crisis, for example, like the pandemic, carrying a lot of baggage, huge amounts of debt, complex supply chains that was so tightly optimized for efficiency and low cost that there was no slack in the system to adapt to the changing disruptive environment that we see around us today. And this lack of preparedness is not an unfortunate accident. It is an entirely predictable result of companies' relentless focus on efficiency and short-term shareholder value maximization. Now, we've got a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to change the economic system so it delivers on the future that we want. And I really believe that comes from us supply chain procurement professionals. Next slide, please, Jess. Now, As predicted in Green Swans, we're seeing an accelerated expansion of the sustainability agenda from responsibility to resilience and regeneration. I can't overemphasize the value of building resilience. It is self-evident in the wake of the COVID-19. Regeneration matters because it is only by regenerating our economies and communities and the wider biosphere that we will be able to achieve true resilience. Clothing rental is a really good example. As a business model, it's different, it's disruptive, it addresses many of the sustainability issues of traditional ownership model. So instead of something being hung up in your wardrobe, clothes are worn again and again, just by different people. So could such a model shift the needle in terms of fashion's impact on the environment? I really think it's time to rethink on the drawing board, to design for the planet. We need to rethink our strategy from sourcing to materials to what customers actually value. Next slide, please. So we've now shifted from digital globalization and Industry 4.0 to sustainability, to moving on to what we've been saying for many years about really, understanding what our customer values. I believe we've moved from yesterday's model of mass production and forward planning to a world where market responsiveness, flexibility, and sustainability are the key drivers. So I think what I'm trying to say here is that instead of designing the supply chain from the factory outwards, it must be designed from the customer backwards. So we fundamentally want to change the supply chain on its head and start with the customer as the departure point rather than as final destination point. In order to link customer value with our supply chain strategy, let's just have a look at some of the key ideas on that can help us to sort of get there. This is based on an earlier study I did with my colleagues from Cranfield University, but fundamentally what we're saying here is that there's 4 key stages of aligning customer value to our supply chains. First of all, what we need to ask ourselves is, what do our customers value? Thereby we identify the value segments. Second, how do we translate these requirements into an offer? So we define the value proposition. Thirdly, what does it take? Identify what does it take to succeed in this market. So we identify the market winners. And finally, how do we deliver against this value proposition? So we develop the supply chain strategy. Now, it's really important to distinguish between lean and agile and recognize that companies must manage both modes simultaneously. Next slide, please, Jess. If we just consider some of the common characteristics of world-class supply chains, and I've just selected the Gartner's top 25 to show you a couple of some of the brand names there. But if we just have a think about what do all of these have in common? Well, firstly, their processes are closely aligned to the company's value proposition. They focus on responsiveness as the key driver rather than cost. They constantly seek to drive out complexity from their supply chains, and increasingly, we talk a lot about supply chain professionals becoming complexity masters. Their supply chains are customer driven rather than supplier driven. So we want to focus on demand pull rather than supplier pushed. They are cross-functional and not siloed, so that their teams work as a process. And I think that gives us some real food for thought and takes us into our next slide, where I think Professor Hal Lee from Stanford University really captured this quite well, where he said, AAA supply chains should be our sort of, I guess you can see it almost like as a North Star. What he believed was that to meet the challenges that businesses see today, we must focus on achieving greater agility, adaptability, and alignment so that businesses can respond more rapidly in terms of volume and variety change. I think in other words, what I'm trying to say here is that we need to consider how we are able to adjust output quickly to match market demand and how we can switch rapidly from one variant to another. Now, I think an important point to make here is that agility is not a single company concept. We also require agility in our people, right? In our supply chain teams. Changing processes is simply not enough. We must recognize that the real benefits lie in people investment, in upskilling, or even reskilling our supply chain professionals so that they're able to adapt to this new landscape. So that takes me into my third dimension, my third perspective that I wish to share with you today. I believe that flexible teams, agile teams, are a real force for disruptive innovation. Companies that are able to respond quickly to changing customer requirements tend to focus on, processes. They break through functional silos to create these superhero process teams and seamless connections. As I mentioned, in terms of agility and cross-functional, they're cross-functional by nature, by definition, and they're best managed by interdisciplinary and diverse teams that are able to increase the clock speed of our supply chains when we require it. So I think the AAA supply chain, simple enough, clearly it's one of those, I guess you could say, academic concepts that have been put forward that look a lot simpler than they are actually to achieve. But I think part of that comes to, legacy solutions and organization mindsets and cultures. And I think to top it off, I think today's decision makers are, often too trapped in traditional linear thinking. They're absorbed by all of the multiple current crises that are demanding their attention to actually think strategically about the forces of disruption and innovation shaping our future. But I really think that we need to focus on the diversity of our skills in our teams. This is crucial if we are truly able to innovate and succeed in globalization 4.0. Next slide, please, Jess. So I think we do need to recognize that transformation won't happen overnight, right? I've been talking about many aspects here in this presentation. And this is all about, how do we upskill a resilient and agile workforce? And I'm now getting to the point of the skills. But it's really important to recognize that a supply chain, procurement, logistics professionals, we've got to really appreciate the landscape that is ever changing and the dimensions that are impacting, that change, the technology, the industry 4.0 and sustainability that we've just been talking about. So I completely recognize that we can't change things overnight, but we are seeing pieces of supply chain being transformed and digitalized. But I think what I see is that it's the connections that bridge those pieces together that are often missing. The systems need to be in place. The people need to have the prerequisite skills to be able to manage the constant crises and complexities that they face. Now, if we think about companies like Ocado and Amazon, Gymshark, for example, they've got the luxury of being able to build their systems from scratch. And I think the true challenge is that because of the legacy solutions that we do have in place, it brings a lot of inadequacies and latency. And technology isn't the only problem. I think vision is a fundamental issue. There's too many people, too many companies, they've been used to doing things in a particular way. If we look at, all of the trends that have characterized, the last 4 or 5 decades since the phrase supply chain management concept was even coined by Booz and Hamilton in 1982, we've been fixed on certain ways of doing things. And that's not to say that those things were wrong. But I think what I'm saying is that we need to do other things as well. There needs to be a better understanding of the entire end-to-end supply chain. People must understand where the levers are and what those levers do. So flexibility is and will remain key going forward. I think for too long, skill sets have been functionally centric. What we need to do is we need to focus on manufacturing, procurement, logistics, and so on, but without a solid enough sense of the overall supply chain. Like we've been focusing on those silos, right? But without a holistic understanding of our overall supply chain and how they impact. So supply chain leaders need to have a better insight into seeing the whole picture. They need to be better at communicating exactly why things need to be done differently and precisely which benefits will accrue as a result. So what we need to do is recognize the importance of leadership skills, change management skills, influencing, persuasion, negotiation skills. I think it's these so-called soft skills that need to come really to the forefront if the challenge of end-to-end supply chain is really going to be met. Because I think the hard skills are either mostly already there, they're already in place, or they're simply just not as relevant as they used to be before. Now, when we start on our digital and sustainable transformation journeys, when we're improving agility and resilience in our end-to-end supply chain, I understand it can be very difficult for people at all levels of the organization to grasp the sheer scale of what we really need to achieve here. And communicating that scale calls for skills that simply were not on a supply chain or procurement leader's radar, just a few years ago. But the future, I think, calls for a reevaluation of the supply chain skills. As I've mentioned before, I believe that yesterday's skills are really not the same as tomorrow's skills. There's been too great a focus, I think, on the left brain skills of analytics, formulae, and so on. But what we also need to do is invest in right brain skills, such as understanding connectivity, thinking in terms of complex systems, and understanding that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And I think that's really the challenge that lies ahead of us all. I'm aware that there's some academics on this webinar today, and I'm sure you'll all agree with me that the challenges we're seeing as scholars, as academics in the academic sector are vastly changed from when we started on our journeys, and there's a lot more to come our way. And we certainly need to be a lot more flexible and agile and teach the kind of, we need to constantly update our curriculum and our syllabuses on a much more regular period. But unfortunately, the bureaucracies and policies that we have in place do often put constraints on. So just like the academic sector, I think many industries, as I've been reflecting on today, face grave challenges, but I think that many of these certainly can be mitigated. The impacts of these can be mitigated if we begin on that journey. So I think just a couple of words to finalize before we go into the Q&A. I would like to end with some words of wisdom once shared with me in the early days of my career. And that is that there's 3 types of businesses: those that watch things happen, those that make things happen, and those that wonder what the hell happened. So let's not be one of those, and hopefully move forward with a shared goal of transforming our supply chain profession by investing in all the prerequisite skills, all the necessary skills that are required today for us to be, really masters of change on this journey that we're all on. So I think with that, I will move to Q&A. Jess?
Thanks, Omera. That was so interesting. So if you have any questions now about any of the content shared or anything else you'd like to ask Omera, you can start putting into the chat. But while we wait, we had a note from Anthony, which you might like to comment on. So he said, one of the challenges in my area is how we stay abreast of the new technological capabilities which drive relevant and robust value and how to best exploit this. We're at risk of being very productive in the day jobs of end-to-end supply chains, but not valuing taking time to step back and look at how we continue to evolve and innovate.
Thanks, Anthony, for that. Thank you, Jess, again. Thanks, Anthony, for that question. It's a really good question. I think it's a balancing act. I understand that, we have a multitude of issues that are, taking up our day job. We have KPIs that have not changed, so therefore they don't incentivize us for things like, for example, the sustainability goals, right? So it is a balancing act, and I believe that leaders need to be a lot more proactive here. They need to help cultivate, create a culture for change management, and really understand that teams need to be supported better to manage the current day job, looking at the low-hanging fruit whilst also having a vision for the future and how we can innovate. So I think it's a real balancing act here. I understand, and this is the challenge that I think many companies have been facing for decades now, is that how do we manage efficiency with effectiveness, for example? How do we focus on responsiveness rather than cost? And I don't think that the right answer is that we do one or the other necessarily. It really is about, it really is a balancing act and understanding that we need to work, I think, team approach, but getting our leaders to support and resource the innovation and technological solutions that can help actually help alleviate some of these issues. Because a lot of these technologies that we see today are enablers and helpers to ease our way of doing things, but that investment still requires some development. It requires time in order to put that into process. So I hope that helps a little bit to answer that question.
Perfect, thank you. We've had another one, which is, how do you think training providers help support the skills development of professionals in our industry?
I think really well, Jess, because I think I've been saying for some years now the importance of developing sort of clusters, and by clusters I meant sort of almost like these hives of activities where we have businesses, we have universities, we have learning academies, whatever you want to call them, institutes, training academies, and we have like third-party providers, right? Like expert training providers. And I think it's very useful to use third-party training providers because they have the competencies, they have the many of the times they have a lot of the cutting-edge information. I think that can help train individuals, and as I've just been speaking about today, right? There's a lot of change on the horizon, and change is sort of ever present now, and it's just part and parcel of it. But when we look at our degree programs, for example, often, graduates take 3 years, 4 years to graduate. It could be 5 years if they're doing a master's, and much of what they've learned in their early years becomes redundant by the time they graduate. And I think topping up your skills with training providers, I think, is a really an excellent addition. And this idea that I was just sharing with you about clusters, I think looking at training providers, like the CILT, like Skill Dynamics, like CIPS. I'm giving a lot of PR here now, but in addition to what we may or may not learn in our programs, and bear in mind, not everybody is doing studies and degree programs. So yet again, a lot of these courses that are offered can help the development of the supply chain and procurement profession. So I think they're key. I think they're fundamental in the training and development of our supply chain professionals.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a really great question to end on. So thank you, Omera, and thank you to everyone for joining today.